You begin this new book of yours, Abundance, with kind of a vision, a utopian vision, some might say. You might say it's realistic, of 2050. There's fresh, abundant water. There's incredible food. There's meat as far as the eye can see, but it's been created in petri dishes. There's no more factory farming.
Scaffolds. It's scaffolding.
Fine. Okay, fine. There's AI, but the AI has not put us out of work. The AI has just made our lives better. You talk about a family going on a weekend trip, a 2-hour jet taking them from New York to London. It's an incredible vision. And I was reading those pages just outside of here in a public park in New York City. And I was like, wow, this is an amazing fantasy. And I look up and it's like within, spitting distance of me, there's 2 homeless guys, one sort of like half naked. There's litter everywhere. And, granted, I used to live in LA. New York is 100 times better than that, and it's still a world away from this vision that you're laying out. So I just want to start by having you guys lay out the elevator pitch of this book. What is the abundance agenda? And what is the gap between our, lived experience, you could say, and the vision that you're laying out as something that isn't utopian, but is within reach if we change our policies in the right way?
So the abundance agenda, just very simply put, is to have the future we want. We need to build and invent more of what we need. It's really it. As we say on the first page, it seems like a little too simple to write a book about this, because who doesn't want more good things? And then you live in California, as both of us did, and you see, actually, a bunch of people have stopped us from building the things we need: housing, clean energy, high-speed rail, and this story can replicate itself across the country, across, frankly, the world. So one of the things we're trying to do in the book is refocus. We're sort of like liberals in the American tradition, right? Refocus liberalism on problems of supply. Where do we not have enough of what we need, and what has stood in the way of us creating abundance there? Then there's the vignette you're talking about, which is also putting technology more at the core of questions of what kind of future we want. A huge just amount of creating a more wonderful future is about what technologies are inserted into it. I spent a lot of my career, and still, arguing for covering the fight to create universal health care. But that insurance, whether you get it through Medicare and Medicaid, or a Bernie Sanders Medicare for All plan, or a private health insurer, that insurance's value to you is based upon the pharmaceuticals, the medical devices, the surgical techniques that are available. The value of Medicare for All is different in a world with GLP-1s than in a world without them. The value of Medicare for All is different if we develop cures for autoimmune diseases right now that baffle doctors than if we don't. I think that the relationship, the politics around technology have become highly dysfunctional over the past, maybe more than decade, but I'm thinking about a decade. And, I think that particularly on the left, where there's a big disillusionment in, I think, the post-social media era. Not wrongly. I think social media's been pretty bad.
But in general, I would say the left is, the left is the side, let's call it that, that's much more critical of technology, much more skeptical that it could bring progress. And you're trying to say no?
And it wasn't always that way. Marx was a very technological thinker. We are somewhat, how many people come here and make a good argument for Marxism? Is that
someone
normal
was I was just talking to Alex Karp, actually, who you would not imagine would be, we were in a very long back and forth about Marx in the Frankfurt School, because he ended up getting a PhD in Germany. Yeah. Anyway, don't ask. But you would not imagine the CEO of Palantir would be talking about Marx, but he was. So you're not the first.
So there's some of that. We're somewhat inspired by this leftist tract from a couple years ago, which has the best name of any book published in the past couple of decades: Fully Automated Luxury Communism. You need
there is no such thing as luxury communism, but yes.
But who knows if it was all fully automated? We're not communists yet, but
yes.
But there is a
wait, hold on. What do you mean yet?
I'm unveiling something right here on honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
There is something about developing, I think, a felt sense that there are just problems we cannot solve and possibilities we cannot create unless we pull technology forward. And that technology can be embedded, it needs to be embedded in sort of just and humane policies and institutions. Technology can be an accelerator of want and inequality as easily as it can be something that diminishes want and inequality. But if you don't think about it, if you don't try to ask yourself, what do we need? Well, then you can't solve those problems. A good example on the left is that there's no decarbonization path that does not include technologically figuring out a way to make green cement. right? Cement on its own would be the third largest emitter measured by countries in the world. We currently cannot, at scale, affordably, make cement in a way that does not release huge amounts of greenhouse gas. If we don't figure that out, there's no path forward here. So trying to sort of rebuild a sense that liberals need to have not just 5 social insurance programs they would like to expand, but 5 technologies they would like to pull forward and sort of orient resources to make happen, that's the other side of the project.
I want to go back to the jump scare moment
Let's talk about
you
Marx.
had.
You really felt.
Because that jump scare that you felt.
Wait, what's the jump scare? When I said Marx or when I
The
said
jump scare moment. Sorry, actually,
again,
there's been several jump scares. I want to go back to the first of the 7 jump scares that you've experienced in the first 10 minutes of this conversation. The jump scare that you felt when you read the introduction to our book and then looked up into New York City. I mean, that's the jump scare that we're trying to get people to feel, is to provide a vision of, yes, utopian, but also I think actually somewhat realistic vision of what we could have in the 2050s if we developed housing abundance, an energy abundance, an accelerated scientific discovery. It's not crazy to think that we could have what we call star pills, which is to say GLP-1 drugs and other life-extending drugs developed in low orbit that are sent to us not by people but by drones that drop off the pills in our front yards. These technologies, I think, are at the cusp of existing. We can pull them forward.
Why in low orbit, Derek?
In low orbit, because they have to be built in low gravity conditions. Thank you. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really important to say that the problem we have, and especially a problem that we have in democratically run places, because you said you came from California and then you came to New York, is that it's not just that we can't invent things that we don't have yet. We also can't build what we understand. The apartment building is a very ancient technology. Elijah Otis came up with the elevator about 170 years ago. But somehow we can't build apartment buildings in San Francisco and Los Angeles and many Democratic-run cities. Energy is, for the most part, especially clean energy, a very ancient technology. Solar energy is 70 years old. Wind turbines are 130 years old. We know how to do geothermal, but we're not actually building it. And in many cases, it's liberal areas that are the worst offenders when it comes to permitting and blocking and making it impossible to actually manifest a clean energy abundant world. And so one thing this book really tries to do is take seriously the idea that Ezra and I, we're from the liberal tradition. Maybe not all the way the Marxist tradition.
The communist tradition.
I'll let Ezra speak for himself. But we're American liberals. We look back at what was accomplished during the New Deal, and we consider that to be an enormous success, an enormous expression of American potential. But something very serious and important has happened to the character and the identity of liberalism in the last 50 years. And to just gloss it very quickly, because I hope you return to it over and over again, I think we went from a world where liberalism was a liberalism of building between the 1930s and 1960s. And then there was a turn in the 1960s and 1970s. And for the last half century, liberalism has too often meant, at the local and state level, a liberalism of blocking. Liberalism as expressed by, oh, you can't build that there because of environmental rules. You can't build that there because it could possibly upset some local homeowners. And in fact, it does seem like, according to studies, as the progressive share of a city population increases, the number of housing permits decrease, because for some reason it does seem to be liberals who are more litigious when it comes to blocking construction. So to end where I started, the jump scare that we want people to feel, and we do want people to literally, viscerally feel it, is the difference between a world that absolutely is possible if we get out of our way and get back into the habit of building, and the world that exists, which is a world where even in places that are run exclusively by Democrats, whether it's in New York or California, it is often our own side whose obsession with process is getting in the way of outcomes.
I'm having echoes of 2 other conversations that I've had on this show. One with Peter Thiel. He's been on twice, but of course he was most famous, or Founders Fund, I think their motto, probably call it that, was this idea that we were promised flying cars and all we got were 140 characters. In other words, we were promised this sort of utopian, incredible, technologically progressive future, but actually we settled for little apps that kept us glued to our phone. And the other is Mark Andreessen, who has written this kind of manifesto of his venture fund, talking about how it's a time to build. You guys sound like you're echoing the arguments of people whose politics, libertarian, center-right, you really disagree with. So help square that for me.
Well, no one is wrong about everything.
Because I'm nice. But a lot of the arguments that you're making now and that you make in the book feel to me, in frankly a very satisfying way, like a lot of the arguments that my wife has been making to me over the dinner table for the past 10 years. YIMBYism, building, getting rid of government regulation. things that we don't necessarily, at least in this moment, associate with the progressive politics that both of you, but especially you, Ezra, typically espouse. So square that for people.
Yeah, so let me make a couple of cuts here and try to distinguish some of it at least, because there are places where I do agree with Peter Thiel. I listened to that interview you did with him. I thought it was really interesting. I listened to him on Joe Rogan right around that same time saying that California's become like Saudi Arabia, and it's like always going to sort of drift on this innovative structure it has, but it can't do anything new. One thing where I probably differ with them is that people talk about deregulation. I think you just did a second ago. And what comes to their mind immediately is deregulating the market. And there are places where I think we believe that needs to happen. So home building is a very good example. But one of the things we're quite focused on is deregulating government itself. So government has more capacity to act and act with a certain strength and capability. High-speed rail, or for that matter, public housing are both good examples of this, where we have made it, I mean, liberals have made it from one direction. Sort of liberals have hobbled government and conservatives have tried to assault it. But we're a little bit more worried about the liberal case here because we're thinking about government in blue states. And so there are places where you would want government to be able to act with more agency, more autonomy, not be quite so vulnerable to endless lawsuits. I did a lot of reporting on high-speed rail for this book, and the environment, high-speed rail is first a very pro-environmental project from the get-go.
Yes.
You are moving people out of cars and into high-speed rail. The environmental clearances on that project began in 2012. By the end of 2024, when we were doing final fact-checking, they were almost, but not yet, quite done. So there are just problems in how government itself is run. People who on my left often will come at us from a different perspective. It's like, we don't need more developer-built housing. We need more public housing. That's fine if you want to build public housing. But right now, under the rules that trigger when you try to use public money to build affordable housing, which is another thing we focus on in the book, you end up forcing the government to build in a way that is much more cumbersome, much slower, much less affordable, and much more likely to make sure that the project never happens at all than when you build with private money. We spent some time talking about a development in San Francisco called Tahanan, which was built in about half the time at about half the cost than the normal affordable housing you see there. But the secret sauce was that Charles and Helen Schwab gave $50 or $60 million to circumvent all public money. And because it never touched public money, it didn't trigger this cascade of rules and regulations. A lot of these rules and regulations might be well-meaning, but they make it so liberal government cannot do what it is attempting to do. The difference where I probably have with Peter Thiel or Mark Andreessen is in aims and goals. Mm-hmm. There's versions of abundance or supply-side work on the right, but for instance, I don't want to unleash an orgy of fossil fuel construction. I want to make clean energy easier to build. Now, maybe we both want to make affordable housing easier to build, and if so, I would love to partner up. But the aims and the goals are meaningful here. The right has its own pathologies, its own problems. I don't think what Doge is doing is making the government more efficient and more capable. I think it is trying to light state capacity on fire. Like, they want to, I'm not saying for Thiel or Andreessen here, but often I think we're caught between a right that wants to destroy government and a left that won't make government work. And so for those of us who actually want to see a capable government, there's almost no home.
Hey guys, Barry here. I hope you enjoyed that clip from the latest episode of Honestly. If you want to watch the full conversation and support the work that we do here at the Free Press of fearless, independent journalism, subscribe today at the top link in this video's description, or just go to thefp.com/join.